Hi everyone, and welcome back to Explore Your Dark Side. This week with a special for Mental Health Awareness Week, and I'm super excited because I have Andrea Newton with me, and she is not just an educator but also a trainer and a speaker about suicide prevention, especially in corporates. Andrea, thank you so much for taking the time to talking to me and to sharing your very important mission with us and help us to make the world a safer place.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolute pleasure. So, Andrea, I already said that you speak about suicide prevention, but can you give us a bit more introduction about you, how you got onto this important path, and maybe what the story behind it?
Sure, yeah. So I've been involved in learning and development for 20 odd years now, which is great because I am actually only 27 years old. You do appreciate that. I've been involved in learning and development for 20 odd years, working mainly with HR professionals and leaders in organisations. My background is actually in HR. So I sort of got involved, first of all, working with organisations, encouraging them to have what I call crucial conversations. So conversations that might be about tackling issues, conversations that might be about performance, etc. But obviously following on from that, there's all sorts of conversations that we really need to encourage in organisations. I'm also a tutor on suicide prevention with the National Centre. So I deliver the City and Guilds qualification in suicide prevention. And you could probably say that that is one of the most crucial conversations that we might ever have. And so my background is a little bit unique actually, with a kind of mixture of HR and leadership development, definitely all in the corporate world. And I'm on a mission at the moment to try to encourage organisations to take more of a community approach to the issue and recognise that actually nobody is immune. And decent employers, employers would have, for example, a fire marshal who's appointed in case there is ever a fire. Why wouldn't they have somebody who's qualified in suicide first aid? Given that 1 in 20 of us will have thoughts of suicide at some time in our lives, it's about really encouraging organisations to recognise that this issue is real. It isn't something that belongs purely in, the public health or the National Health Service domain. This is something that every organisation needs to really have an awareness around, and that's my mission.
Yeah, but it's so important. It's like so important work you do, and I think 1 in 20 is like the number is just so high, and that's the number we know. So there's potentially even more people who thought about it, and I found it really like a brave mission as well, because it's so difficult to talk about it. I feel it's still like often a taboo. There's so much stigma around it. It's always the others, but not in our circle.
Yeah.
How do you open them up to acknowledge that it can happen? It's real.
I think my approach is very practical, very results focused. I have a strong corporate background, so I don't come at this from a kind of social care position. This is very much about sharing with people the truth, busting a few myths. For example, people think that everyone who's having thoughts of suicide, they're the people that are on the bridge, pacing, looking down into the water below, when actually someone having thoughts of suicide could be sat opposite you in a performance review. They could be returning from sickness absence and you're doing a return to work interview, and actually what you discover is it wasn't really tonsillitis, it was actually a mental health problem. So it's really about encouraging organisations to recognise that actually most people who die from suicide are of working age. So even if you just do the stats, the likelihood is somebody in your organisation at some point is having these difficult thoughts. And to go from stress to overwhelm, it doesn't have to be a mental illness that takes us there. In fact, it could just be that we just can't cope with the demands of life anymore. Just a human, condition. So I try to engage organisations by working with it from a very practical, pragmatic position, because at the end of the day, most businesses would want to protect their employees, they'd want to protect their bottom line, and they'd certainly want to protect their reputation. Imagine if, for example, there was a coroner's inquest that was looking at somebody who died by suicide, and interviewing the family suggested that this person had been under, undue stress at work, that had perhaps even contributed towards them, taking that decision. So it really is important that organisations realise, they do have a part to play in this.
Yes, and I think what you say about the reputation bit, it's a massive, well, I don't want to say selling point, but I mean, that's probably what it is at the end.
Yeah.
And because, just like with the social media, things go crazy, things go public. And I felt like when last year for Mental Health Awareness Week, I published a post about suicide in the, when, Chester Bennington, Kate Spade. And I feel if a VIP commits suicide, it's a big thing everyone is talking about. But I feel like in our everyday lives, it's a day-to-day thing. Someone is committing suicide from the everyday rate, and it's still so difficult to open up. So I think, the reputational part is really probably the most important point.
Yeah. But I mean, if you think about it, just thinking about the numbers, at least 6,000 people died of suicide in the UK last year. And we say at least because we actually believe the number could be as much as 25% higher because of the stigma that sits around it, and because the coroner has to make a decision whether there was absolutely intent to die or perhaps it was an accidental death. So there's lots of little reasons why the numbers that we know of aren't necessarily accurate. But 6,000 people, if you think about it, Stephanie, that's the equivalent of an aeroplane full of passengers falling out of the sky every other week. Now, if that was happening in the airline industry, if there was an aeroplane coming down every other week, there would be an absolute uproar. But those are the same numbers as people who are dying by suicide in the UK last year. And it's just a phenomenal number. And I think sometimes people are ignorant to some of the truths around it. And actually, they don't want to acknowledge it. Because, if you acknowledge it, you have to accept it's real. And if it's real, maybe you need to do something about it. And if it's real, maybe, you know somebody who's vulnerable. And it's actually the silence that sits around it that kills. Because I can't talk about it. Yeah. It's just like any other human condition. If I'd got a migraine, I would have no issue saying to somebody, oh, you've not got any painkillers, have you? But actually, any kind of, mental health problem or even just, really dark thoughts, we just don't share that in the same way, even though it is still a human condition.
Yeah. And I think especially with like suicide, because it feels like the end point, like to the whole thing around mental health, even though it might, as you said earlier, not only caused by mental illness.
Yeah.
But I think it's so difficult, it's to have these I think all of us know at least some person who has a partner, a parent or whatever, who has committed suicide at one point in their lives. And the conversations are very, very uncomfortable and very difficult to have with loads of emotions of the people. So what would you suggest is the best thing to do if you feel like someone might have thoughts or darker thoughts around suicide? What would you suggest to do, or what is the best thing we can do?
I would really encourage, I'd really love us as a society to actually get more comfortable with the subject so that people do feel that they can talk about it, and I'm sure you've seen there's been loads of campaigns where they've said, oh, if you're feeling that way, you must reach out. actually, if you're feeling hopeless, if you're feeling worthless, if you're feeling as though you're a burden to other people, the last thing you're going to do is reach out. Yeah. So my mission really is to encourage people to actually get more familiar with the signs and symptoms, to be able to notice if, you know, someone's behavior is really very different. Maybe you know something about them, perhaps they're struggling to get over a bereavement, or, you know, maybe something's happened to them, I don't know, redundancy or some sort of trauma, and all of a sudden their mood just seems, you know, really very different, the behaviour's different. And just for people to have the courage to ask the question, you know, are you okay? Are you struggling? I'm concerned about you. You know, are you having thoughts of suicide? But we're so scared of saying it that actually we build a kind of mystique around it. You know, it's almost like Harry Potter. If you've ever seen the Harry Potter with Voldemort, he who shall not be named, you know? And it's almost, we almost give it power by being afraid to tackle it head on. Because actually, if I ask you and you say yes, oh my God, what am I going to do? And so it really is about us getting much more comfortable with it as a subject, recognizing it's just part of the human condition. And actually, you know, you could be the difference between someone's life and death, literally. You know, to have a conversation with someone. You don't have to be a mental health expert. You don't have to, you know, be a trained counsellor. The approach that we take from the National Centre is very practical, very pragmatic. What can I do to help you? How can I help you lighten the load? You know, if it's an organisation, who can we signpost you to? Can I put you in touch with somebody who can give you some help? And it's a very practical approach we need, and really not to be afraid of it. Because as you said earlier, chances are we all know somebody or know of somebody who's been affected. And what we know from all of the research is anyone that's had any experience of suicide in their lives is as much as 60% more likely to consider suicide themselves. So it really is the ripple on the pond. You know, we don't notice the impact that each death by suicide will have. You know, even the language we use, you know, it used to be, the language used to be that people would commit suicide. It hasn't been a crime since 1961. So why do we still talk about committing in that way, you know? So it's also about challenging language. It's about challenging attitude. And it's like, as a society, it's just about recognizing nobody is immune, but we can all make a difference.
And I think what you say with no one is immune, I think also there is not everyone who has like dark thoughts or suicidal thoughts is suicidal, you know, not everyone really wants to commit it. It's sometimes also, you know, just the reach out because we don't know what to say, maybe, you know. It's difficult to talk to someone. As you said, the last thing someone will probably do is reaching out.
Yeah, it's a really difficult thing to do. I mean, the logo that I have for my business is a bubble, because the way that I describe it to people is it's almost like being trapped in a toxic bubble. So you can see people, but not clearly. You can kind of hear it, but the noise is a little bit muffled. And all my thoughts are trapped in my head because I can't verbalize it. I can't come to you and say, I'm having thoughts of suicide in the way that I might do, I've got a migraine. And so there's nowhere for those thoughts to go. So, you know, it's almost as though it just intensifies and we get trapped in a toxic bubble. And actually reaching out when you're weighed down with those emotions and those feelings, you're asking almost the impossible. And that's why my belief is that we've got to learn to reach in. And especially organisations as a community, you know, you expect people to come to work and leave all their personal stuff at the door. You expect them to perform to a high standard, and you send out engagement surveys and you measure how happy people are. But actually, we don't want to have a really important conversation to talk to somebody probably about the biggest secret that they've ever carried, because we just don't see that as our issue. And we need to get much better at that, because suicide is a community-wide problem and it needs a community to solve it. And you can put lots of energy into blaming the national health, you can blame, public health, you can blame government, but research from the Samaritans tells us was something like 1.77 billion pounds short of the funding needed. So you can put your energy and effort into complaining and blaming and pointing the finger, or you can put your energy and your effort into actually learning and understanding a little bit more yourself so that you can make a difference.
And do so.
I was joking with some clients, for the cost of doing the actual qualification is the equivalent cost of buying 42 bottles of Tipex. So you choose, you can have 42 bottles of Tipex in your stationery cupboard so that you can keep whiting out the headlines, or you can spend that same amount of money to get somebody qualified through City and Guilds to actually be available within your organisation if somebody needs your help. Yeah. And it's that, make the decision, guys.
And I think especially, as you said, community approach. I mean, in the end, obviously, organizations, we are all people, like people with people interacting.
Sure.
But we are not that close as we are in like our, private relationships. So I think if you have someone in your organization who can take over having these really difficult conversations, you just pinpoint someone towards this person, it's just so valuable.
Yeah.
Really well invested money.
Yeah, but it's like, organisations will have first aiders already for the kind of physical health and safety challenges. They don't expect that first aider to complete open heart surgery, for example. What they expect them to do is keep the person safe until professional help can be sought. And it's exactly the same with suicide first aid. I'm not asking you to become a counsellor or a therapist or, their lifelong confidant and problem solver, just to help keep someone safe until they can get the help that helps them. And that help can be lots of different things. It might not even be, medical or mental health issues. It might be that person's really weighed down with finance, with debt. And a practical approach would be to perhaps give them some help with, debt management, put them in touch with somebody who can help them do that. So it's kind of a whole range of things that if organisations were less corporation and more community, it's easy, practical things that people can do that help us deal with overwhelm.
I love what you said, but it can be something practical, because often it doesn't have to be an emotional conversation. No. Sometimes if you're stuck in a problem, you lose any hindsight, you don't know what to do, and the problem just becomes so big that if someone gets you out of your own head, suddenly things clear up and you realize, oh well, hang on, there is actually a way. It might be.
Yeah. I was reading some research in the weekend from Australia, where they've got a real problem and have been doing an awful lot of work around it. And the clinical psychologist who'd done the research was saying, they've been doing all these things, but actually the numbers haven't dropped. And so the suggestion is that it's about actually helping people develop coping strategies. And strategies that help us cope isn't just about mental health. It is, as we've said, we've used finance because, people who are in debt, perhaps people who enjoy gambling, for example, they might find themselves in a situation that they can't seem to find their way out of. It could be that you've had a bereavement or a loss or a relationship breakdown. It could be that, your kid's in trouble with the police. All sorts of things that when they mount up, just feels like overwhelm, that you can't cope. And as you said, the human brain, we are meaning-making animals. We constantly look for solutions. And maybe if I can't find a solution to my debt, my redundancy, my bereavement, the solution is suicide. Because the other myth that we need to bust is that actually people don't want to die, they just want the pain to stop. Yes. Suicide happens when the pain exceeds resources for coping with pain. And therefore, if we can find a way of helping people by just lightening the load a little bit so that they can inch back from the edge, you know, just a 20-minute conversation could actually save someone's life.
I really love the point of like the pain to end, because yeah, oh my god, yeah, that's really like, yeah, it was a really eye opener. So if someone, you know, if we have the conversation, we dare to ask,
Yep.
are you okay? And which I think is really difficult, because especially in our society where we have this question of how are you doing, and we don't even expect an answer, it's difficult. But so if we manage to get through the, you know, I'm fine, thanks, and really have maybe another question, and the person opens up. So what would you say to do? What is the next thing to do? So the person says, you know what, I'm not good, I'm having dark thoughts, etc. What do we do from then? So what
the obvious question is, what is it that's brought you to that feeling? What is it that's brought you to this place? You know, I don't want you to be my counsellor. I don't want you to, you know, kind of lay me down on the couch and, you know, give me your best advice in terms of what I should do. Maybe all I want to do is like relieve the intensity in my head where all this stuff is just going around. You know what it's like if you've got a problem that you can't solve and you can't sleep at night and your head just keeps ruminating and it turns it around, and actually all on your own you turn the problem into something much bigger maybe than it really is. Yeah. So it's a very practically focused conversation. You know, what is it that's making you feel this way? What do you think might help you? What sort of things can we look at? A very practically focused, results-oriented conversation. And dependent on where the person is, if you believe they're at high risk, then you look at how do I connect them with professional services. Yeah, and that could be 999 if that's where the person is. It might be that you take them to A&E. It might be that you offer to go to the GP with them. It will vary dependent on the individual. But what we're looking for is a very practical approach. You know, ask questions, understand the issue, explore what's going on, really listen to the things that matter to that person. And you know what, Stephanie, sometimes just that conversation, having permission to say, this is how I'm feeling, and not be judged, not be criticised, not be made to feel stupid. Sometimes just being able to get it out of my head gives me enough clarity of thought to recognise that maybe there is another way. So it's not some huge great science. It's just about being a decent human being, whereby you ask, you explore, you listen, and then you help that person action plan.
Love it. I love it. Yeah, I think this is what you say is so valuable, because it removes the anxiety of having these conversations and just be like, you know, you're just having a conversation and you're just being there. You don't have to take the emotional pressure on. Just having a practice, because I think I don't know, but I would assume that some people might, or most people might be scared of having the emotional garbage that is, you know, someone talking about what got them there, and they maybe are scared, you know, want a protection mechanism because they don't want to end there as well. So I would assume that this might be part of what makes it so difficult.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, from the work that you do, in terms of the masks that we sometimes wear and the feelings that we hide, and, you know, we're not always true to ourselves. And typically it's because we're afraid of judgment, we're afraid of other people's opinions. And actually, I don't want your opinion, because your opinion isn't going to help me. Perhaps what I want is just a practical way forward of dealing with this. Because you know what, this didn't happen overnight. Suicide is rarely the event of a one-off issue. Okay, it's typically, more often than not, something that builds over time. It's a bit like a continuum. So someone might go from having thoughts of suicide to creating a plan to then perhaps attempting. So it's a timeline, it's a continuum. At any point on that line, by giving that person practical support, you could actually help them take a step back. Yeah? And it really is just a very simple process. We work with a 3-stage approach that goes spot the signs, start the dialogue, help save a life. Because fundamentally, it could be the most crucial conversation that you'll ever have. And sometimes people say to me, oh, I'd feel really awkward asking the question, you know, are you having thoughts of suicide? And I said, well, okay, you've got two choices here. You can either feel awkward for 2 minutes while you ask, or you can feel awkward for the rest of your life when one day that person doesn't turn up to work anymore. Which would you rather?
And then regret that you didn't ask the question. Yeah.
Totally. You know, and so often when we hear about suicide reported in the press, so often people will say, oh, you know, I had no idea. Yeah, you did. You know, maybe you weren't listening. Maybe you've not been trained to pick up on signs and symptoms. Maybe you were so caught up that day in the busyness of your own world. Because actually the research tells us that as many as 80% of people do ask for help, but they ask in a way that we don't necessarily recognise it as such. And we've got to get better at that as a society. You know, awareness is brilliant. There's been loads of work around awareness, okay? The age of awareness is past. We need action. And that involves people taking a deep breath, putting their big girl pants on, and being bold enough to say, I'm worried about you. Your behaviour seems really different.
Do you have an example of people asking for help? And, you know, you said it's maybe we don't recognize how they ask for help. Do you have an example for it? So that people know maybe
there's loads of different things that you might notice. It might be as simple as the person stops taking care of themselves, you know, so they've no self-worth, self-value, their personal hygiene maybe. It could be that they start to behave recklessly, you know, almost as though it doesn't matter what happens to them. So driving recklessly, or perhaps drinking more, or, you know, signs and symptoms like that. It could be, you know, that the person perhaps has, you know, suffered with a bereavement and they just don't seem to be getting over it. They're really struggling with the grieving process. And it's kind of putting all those little things together and going, something's not right here. People do use language, and you know what? We're very naughty in our casual use of language. We say things like, oh, you know, I'm really depressed. No, you're not. You're just a bit fed up because it's Monday, it's raining, and there's no carrot cake, you know? And so the casual use of language also sometimes masks the reality. So if I was to say to you, oh, do you know what? I just can't cope with this anymore. Your automatic response might be, oh, don't be so daft. Of course you can. You're more than capable. I know that you can do this. When actually, I can't cope anymore. Do I really mean that? So before you give me your glib answer, it's about tuning in and hearing, feeling as well as fact.
Yeah, and it's really about seeing the other person, really.
Yeah.
Seeing someone.
Yeah.
So if someone is, you know, someone might listen to this or watch this and might have had or has thoughts of suicide, what's the best number for them to reach out? Do you have one where they can get help?
Yeah, in the UK, I would suggest that the Samaritans are always the best people. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, they will listen. And they will listen to you. You don't have to be having thoughts of suicide. Yeah, you don't have to be at that end point. If you're at a point where you're feeling that life is starting to get the better of you, you're starting to feel overwhelmed, their listening is just amazing. Just the support of that. And the number's 116 123. So the Samaritans would always be my go-to in that situation. However, there's lots of other fabulous charities. For example, Papyrus, they deal more so with young people with youth suicide. And there's organisations called Young Minds. So there's lots of organisations out there. But if you're in crisis, 116 123. Or get yourself to your local hospital, your local A&E, and explain to them that you're worried you can't keep yourself safe.
So if organizations want to work with you or, you know, realize how important the issue is, so you give talks, but you also are a trainer. How can get people or organization in this case, how can they get in touch with you?
Okay, the easiest way is via the website, which is abdcct.co.uk. I'm also on,
as well in the
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also on LinkedIn, Andrea Newton, and you'll often find me banging on about suicide, to the point that I became known as the Suicide Woman, which I wasn't sure whether that was quite the brand that I wanted. But yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. But yeah, the best bet is via the website, and drop me an email, and I'd be more than happy to chat to you about the different options that are available.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to give us a bit of an insight in this really important topic, and also shaking us up a bit on how important it really is. I really do appreciate you taking the time and coming on. Thank you so much.
No, you're very welcome. I think the more people that are brave enough to say the word, the more difference we can make. So, you know, I'm happy for any opportunity that might just make the difference to even just one person. So thank you very much, Stephanie, for the opportunity.
My pleasure. I will talk to you soon and say thank you so much.
Cheers.